Okay, so what is a jet ski? Why do we care? All right, a jet ski is Kawasaki's trademark name for a personal watercraft. What's a personal watercraft? Well, a personal watercraft is not a boat. A boat is something for multiple people you get into, right? If you're in a boat, you're in a boat. Personal watercraft is something you're on, right? So if you climb onto it like a sit-down like a Sea-Doo, right? That's a watercraft. It has an engine to propel you, right? So that's what a personal watercraft is, something you're on, right? A jet ski, you're on it. A Sea-Doo, you're on it. And that's probably the best way to explain that simply. And Kawasaki chose jet ski as their trade name in the early 70s, when this is all there was. And as it evolved, all their line of sit-downs, all their lines of personal watercraft are still jet skis. And that's their trademark name. And then they have the model numbers, the 550, the 650, and so on and so forth. Yamaha chose Wave Runner, right? They still have different models, just Wave Runner is the Yamaha's model of personal watercraft. And then Sea-Doo went another direction. Bombardier went a different direction. They chose Sea-Doo to market as the trade name. So a Sea-Doo is a Sea-Doo, even though it gets confusing. Nobody really knows who Bombardier is, but Bombardier is the holdings company. They chose Sea-Doo as their marketing, their trademark. So that gets us to where we are with the jet skis. Why are we going to talk about jet skis? We're talking about jet skis today. We're going to go through the line specifically of stand-up jet skis. Whenever someone refers to it as a jet ski, they think of a stand-up, even though all Kawasaki's are jet skis, even the sit-downs. But because they were for 15 years, there was nothing else except stand-ups. The jet skis became that household name, kind of like Kleenex, right? So let's go ahead and get started. So back in the 60s, a guy by the name of Clayton Jacobson decided there's got to be a better way. The logistics of taking a boat to the water when he didn't want to take his family out, he wanted to go out by himself or whatever, was just too much. So he came up with this crazy idea and built this crazy little contraption. And then Bombardier decided to take it and make it into something called a Sea-Doo and market it. They signed a contract. I think it was a 2 or 3 year contract, and they made these things called Sea-Doos. And they were a flop. They didn't make it. So Kawasaki was in the wings, and they went to Clayton and said, hey, when that contract is sunsetted, we want you to do something with us. And then Clayton decided to come up, his next idea was a stand-up, something you stand up on. And it didn't have a pivoting handle pole. It was a fixed handle pole, and it didn't really work. So they came up with a pivoting handle pole. And then somewhere deep down inside Kawasaki, they realized they had this tiny little motor. It's a 400cc 2-stroke, and the bottom of a container ship, that the captain would push a button and fire up this motor, and it would pump water out of the belly of the boat, right? It was a bilge pump. It did not have a throttle on it. It was not made to be throttled, but they said, hey, we could kind of bend this around a corner and make it work for this project. So they started with this motor. They built this very first ski called the JS 400, and this is what it looks like. And there was 2 different versions. One had a flat bow up here, and another version had a V bow, and we'll see that later. But in the meantime, the way to access these is you're going to lift the handle pole up, and this has like a rubber band style latch that hooks. And we latch the handle pole up and hold it up here. It's kind of cumbersome, but then we'll flip the hood off here. And this is what it looks like. You have your fuel tank, your 2-cylinder engine, 2 spark plugs, 2 cylinders, single carb with a tuned pipe. This put out like 25 horsepower, and it went probably almost 30 miles an hour. And it was a fantastic start. And they utilized the 400s from 72 or 3 clear up into 78 or 9, I believe, or 80 as when they did these. And then they went up to a 440, which produced another 3 or 4 horsepower, and it gave it another mile an hour or 2. And the 440 was successful as well, clear up and through the 80s all the way to 1990. And then somewhere around 86, they moved the exhaust from above the bond flange here to below the bond flange over here. So that was one of the biggest things they did, was they moved the bond flange, or they moved the exhaust to the bond flange, and that got the exhaust out of your face. Okay. So then in 1982, they decided they needed more horsepower. So they decided to up the bore size to the 440, and they went to a 550. And that yielded somewhere around 35 horsepower. And at that point, they were able to go more than 30 miles an hour. So then by 86, they were rolling pretty heavy, doing really well. They decided to invest more money into the industry. So they stood back and they said, what can we do? We can make the 550 more horsepower. And they pushed it up to 40 horsepower with a different exhaust and a larger carburetor. And they also decided to introduce the very first sit-down. This is the very first sit-down. It's called an X2. This X2 stands for experimental two-seater. And they have a lock on the front here. The hood's latched in two places. There's a seat over here. Kind of a seat, although they're a lot more comfortable to ride standing up. And then, come around here. Sorry. And then the hood lifts up here. And it's a sliding latch mechanism. It comes off. And again, there's a two-cylinder engine. This isn't the engine that goes in this, but just pretend it is. And it had a plastic gas tank much smaller than this. And this was the world's first sit-down. I guess technically it was the world's second sit-down, if you count the Sea-Doo first. But it produced somewhere around 52 horsepower. It went probably 35 to 36 miles an hour off the showroom floor. And they claimed they did 38, but I never seen one do 38 before. So over the years, when the 440 was released, the 400 was released with the V bow and the flat bow. Over the years, the flat bow won out, so they sunsetted the V bow. Well, they decided to bring it back on this X2, and it was such a success, they carried it over into the 650 stand-up the next year. So this one has a V bow as well, and it wasn't as successful in the racing environment as it was in the recreational world. But this thing has a handle pole bracket here, a little handle pole stand that's kind of cumbersome. They come out here, drop in here, and it stays in put in theory. And there's another latch over here that lifts there, and the hood lifts off, and we have access to the engine. This had the same exact motor as the X2, 52 horsepower or so. 37 miles an hour was an average normal top speed for these. And they came with, just like the X2, they came with oil injection and a Kian carb. Kawasaki went away from the Mikuni carbs when Kian came out with the CDK. The only issue was they favored oil injection. So they went to that. Every Kawasaki jet ski had oil injection with a Kian carb, except the 92 to 95 550s that had a unique carb all on its own. And then also the early 650s had side exhaust over here, just like this one doesn't have it. The early 650s in 86, 87 to 90, 1990, they had a side exhaust as well, just like the 550s did. And then by 91, they decided to go with a larger carburetor and rear exhaust. And then after, that's what made the 650 the big hit that it was. So, and then while this was all going on with the 650 and the X2s, and then Kawasaki had developed other sit-downs, they've started finding their groove. Yamaha introduced their own sit-downs the same time the X2 and the 650 came out. They were waiting in the corner for the patent to run out on the stand-up. And so they had the benefit of a lot of other watching everything go on, watching what racers wanted, what riders wanted. And the rear exhaust was a big thing in the 90 Superjet. The very first Yamaha stand-up was called the 90 Superjet, and it was the square nose. They referred to it as a square nose. That was their first generation. So Kawasaki responded by building the 750, and this is 65 horsepower, and they did over 42, 43 miles an hour stock. And the hull was longer, wider, and then they went back, they departed the V-bow idea and went back to the flat bow because the Superjet was so successful with the flat bow. So they carried that back over and brought that back. And then same thing, this here, this handle pole stand here has been the same since 92 to the 2023 handle pole. They're all the same now. The same basic fundamental with the locking latch, and the hood is kind of they've carried that all the way through forward. So this is a 750. And of course it's got an aftermarket pipe which takes up the whole engine bay. And like I said, this thing is in desperate need of restoration, but there was three different versions of the engines for these 750s. And they varied from 65 to 75 horsepower, and they range from 42, 43 miles an hour to 47, depending on what ski it came in. And they carried through this setup all the way through 2002. And this is actually a 98. This is actually the later version, and the only way you can tell at the hulls is there's a bond flange here that your fingers fit up under. And when you get up to the front of the bow, you can't put your fingers under here. This is the 98 and newer boat. And that's the only way I've ever been able to tell the difference without a tape measure. So then in 2003 was another big year for Kawasaki. They decided to reinvest yet again, and they came out with the SXR 800. Now this is not an 800. This is not a Kawasaki version of the 800. This is an aftermarket version. So just kind of pretend it is. All the lines are the same. The hood's the same. Hoods are interchangeable. Everything's pretty much the same except these gunnels right here. So bear with me on that. But so Kawasaki invested heavily. They decided to go to an 800cc engine, and they had all the tooling and everything ready to go. They were ready to launch this product, and a tsunami hit Japan, and it was catastrophic. It wiped out the entire facility. So Kawasaki was forced, rather than missing out on dropping the 2003 800, right? They wanted to put it into production. They went back to the 750 engine and reused it, and all they did was change the cylinder sleeves to a bigger bore. So in essence now, the 800 as we know it was an upgraded big bore version of the 750. This was not the engine that was designed to go in the 800, but that's why if you've ever been on an 800, you'll notice they're just a little bit lethargic. They're just a little bit underpowered. That's why we ended up with what we ended up with. But my hat's off to Kawasaki. They made lemonade out of it. They made the launch date. It worked. It was a big success, and they ran these all the way till 2012. And that's what the 800 looks like. Same thing with this. This has an aftermarket handle pole, so it doesn't have the same latch that one does. But, so same thing, 2-cylinder. This is actually a 750 motor because this is one of my skis. But this is what the inside of an 800 looks like, with an aftermarket pipe and an aftermarket tank. So now we get to 2017 when they decided that they were going to come back out with a 4-stroke stand-up after a 5-year hiatus. They were waiting, I don't know what they were waiting for, I'm not going to pretend to, but so then of course, ironically enough, they decided to bring back the V-bow, which I don't really understand. It is actually, I guess it's a partial V-bow or a hybrid, but technically that is a V-bow, so it'd be really interesting to talk to the guys at Kawasaki to find out what they liked better about it. And then anybody who's watched this channel, they know this ski, this has a different motor in it. This has a different engine than the actual 1500, although you can't tell, it looks the same. Yeah, but this is what the 1500 looks like. And these are supposed to be 60 miles an hour out of the box. I've not witnessed that myself. I think they're closer to 55, 56 off the showroom floor. And they're supposed to be 160 horsepower. So that kind of sums it up where we're at today. This is the current jet ski models that we're riding, and we're going to go into deeper detail on each ski individually. I just want to kind of give a rundown for those of you, if you're looking to buy one, if you want to understand the history a little better, where we come from, how we got here. And other than that, we'll cut it off here. And I want to throw a special shout out to the Merlin's Old School Garage and Fab Rats and the Pest Control guys for sending me. A lot of you viewers have showed up here from them, and I appreciate that. Thank you all for subscribing, and thank you all for watching.